Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're stepping back into the 19th century to saddle up alongside Arthur Morgan and the Vanderlyn gang in Red Dead Redemption 2. In case you've missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description down below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Red Dead Redemption 2 was released on October 26, 2018, and garnered massive praise for its storytelling and graphical design. The massive open world brings players into a fictional version of the Wild West, spanning from an homage to New Orleans in the east known as Saint Denis, to the unforgiving cold and snow of the Grizzlies, across the beautiful plains of West Elizabeth and over the vast deserts of New Austin. You can hunt, fish, hold up stagecoaches and banks, and live the life of an outlaw in the Wild West. Well, you can live the outlaw life for a short while at least. See, in 1899, the way of the outlaw was coming to an end. The far-reaching hand of modern society was stretching across the land, bringing laws and civilization to places and people that were far from tame. Organizations like the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hired to round up those who fought the new ways, and only a handful of outlaw gangs were holding on as the century prepared to turn. One of those gangs was led by a man known as Dutch Vanderlyn. They'd been causing havoc in the West for years, and early in 1899 they found themselves in the small town known as Blackwater, running the usual scams and searching for ways to make enough money to buy some land of their own further out west. But things were about to take a bad turn for the group, as the decision to rob a ferry would end with Dutch shooting a young girl, forcing the gang to uproot and flee east into the Grizzly Mountains during a snowstorm. Several members were caught or killed in the chaos, but those who survived got the worst of it, as they would be hunted over the coming months, leading to the gang's ultimate demise in the end. Today, we'll be looking at the first part of their downfall, and over the next few weeks, we'll be dissecting what went wrong and picking apart their way of life, while comparing the world they lived in to the world that wanted them gone. The opening chapter of Red Dead Redemption 2 is titled Coulter, and we join the Vanderlyn gang as they move achingly slow through a snowstorm. Things aren't looking good, and as they desperately search for shelter, we meet the main player protagonist, Arthur Morgan, who rides up to let Dutch know he's found a place they can hold up in just a little further down the trail. Historically, traveling through such poor conditions wasn't a great idea. Frostbite and other cold-related injuries and illnesses can affect even the hardiest of travelers, and we can only imagine how desperate they must have been to venture up into the mountains, knowing the low chances of survival that journey would entail. And that begs the question, how far would you go to preserve a dying way of life? We find out about the ferry robbery and the fact that it went very wrong early on in Chapter 1, so we can understand why the gang would need to flee. But their way of doing things is quickly becoming impossible as society grows and changes. Even the opening screens tell us that the outlaw way of life is coming to an end, so is it even worth the risk of dying in the mountains when facing inevitable change like that? As the gang files into one of the buildings in the ghost town of Coulter, we see them at what is likely the lowest point any of them have ever seen. They're on the verge of freezing to death. They have very little food or chances of finding food, and one of them has already died from some combination of wounds suffered in the escape and the cold. Dutch gives a speech, trying to rally everyone and give them some form of hope. But how much good that does is up for debate. At that point, most of them are probably wondering what their chances of actually making it out of the mountains are, and they are likely questioning if what they are going through will end in anything positive. As Arthur and Dutch ride back out into the storm to search for John and Micah, Arthur tries to question what happened at the ferry job, and Dutch makes a point of telling Arthur he needs his help to bring everyone through this situation. Loyalty is important to Dutch, and he knows that hard times like being stuck in a blizzard with no sign of a way out could threaten the group and his leadership. This is a theme we'll see a lot of as we go through the story. Dutch makes a lot of speeches, mostly centered around rallying the gang behind one idea or another. And anytime anyone questions him or his ideas, he accuses them of losing faith in him and not being loyal. But the Vanderlyn gang isn't the only group in the mountains. After a short ride through the snow, Arthur and Dutch run across Micah, who, like Arthur earlier, had been sent out to scout ahead. He's found a cabin that seems to be teeming with life, and as they approach it to inquire about some help for their predicament, they realize the group inside is made up of members of a rival gang known as the O'Driscolls. It turns out they took over the cabin forcefully, taking a woman named Sadie hostage while killing her husband. Sadie will wind up being important to the story later on, but for now, she's a grieving widow who the gang chooses to protect. And that tells us a bit about who Dutch Vanderlyn and his gang of misfits are. While some outlaw gangs might be made up of hardened criminals who come together because they enjoy causing chaos and sowing fear, the Vanderlyn gang is made up of people who, for one reason or another, found themselves without a place to call home or a family to love. There are those like John Marston and Arthur Morgan, who were taken in by Dutch when they were young, as well as those like Pearson, the camp cook, who Dutch rescued from loan sharks, and Reverend Swanson, who was invited in after saving Dutch's life. Many of them were outcasts of society who just didn't fit into the world anywhere else. The early days of the gang were focused on helping the poor by robbing the rich, a sentiment borrowed from the mythical Robin Hood, and something that Dutch held as a justification for their actions and existence. This way of doing things wouldn't last, however, as Dutch would eventually give up on changing the world and choose instead to focus on putting the gang first. This is all important to the story overall because it builds the foundations of a group that is willing to do anything to survive. They're all extremely loyal to Dutch for taking them in when society shunned or exiled them, and they are desperate to hang on to the freedom and idealism that Dutch preaches. They are so loyal and desperate that they are willing to follow him into the mountains in the middle of a blizzard to escape the law that is only on them because Dutch did something horrible. In some ways, the Vanderlyn gang resembles a cult. They follow a charismatic leader who preaches to them about how his way of doing things is the one true way and demands unquestioning loyalty and obedience. Questioning anything Dutch says is looked down upon, and there is some degree of control over who the gang members interact with outside of the group and how they spend their money and time. It isn't a true cult in the sense that members do have some autonomy and are able to come and go as they please, leaving entirely if they choose to. But the way that Dutch speaks to them and influences their way of thinking and living is a form of subliminal control that many cults aren't even able to achieve. Arthur takes a trip with Javier to find John, who's been missing for several hours in the storm, and the pair find their missing comrade on the side of a cliff, fighting to survive the cold and some pretty gnarly wounds given to him by a pack of wolves. Once John has been returned safely, it's time to find some food, and Arthur heads out on a hunting trip with Charles that teaches the player how to use a bow. While these missions seem like nothing more than tutorials and introductions on the surface, they actually serve to show just how hardy and strong the gang is at its core. John was able to survive being attacked by wolves in the middle of a blizzard in the mountains for an entire night, a feat that not many would be able to pull off while living to tell the tale. Arthur and Charles are able to provide food for the group even in the harshest of conditions, where a trip to the grocery store wasn't exactly an option. And this is all without Dutch even needing to be involved in any way. You could take away his teachings and still have that hardy, survivalistic ability that would actually give the group pretty decent chances of making things work outside of society without needing to rob and murder. And that's something that we can start to really notice, even this early in the story, as the missions that don't involve the gang's namesake have a different feel to them. Those first couple of outings felt like they had a purpose, something that would ultimately lead to a net positive for the group. The next thing that we leave the camp for is based on Dutch, though, and involves hunting down his arch-nemesis Colm O'Driscoll. This mission sees Arthur and most of the rest of the men ride through the mountains to another small ghost town in search of Colm and his men. Ultimately, they find their target and wipe out a whole group of O'Driscolls before discovering plans that will lead to the first train robbery of the game. But this outing doesn't really provide a benefit to the gang as a whole. No one is saved, no resources are gained. We end in basically the same way that we started. On the way back to camp, we run across a stray O'Driscoll gang member. But instead of shooting this one, we capture him and take him prisoner in hopes of finding out more about what Colm and his group were planning in regard to the train robbery. A few days pass and the snow starts to melt. And in reality, the smart thing to do would be to head down out of the mountains and try to flee as far from the law as possible. But Dutch can't do things the easy way. He insists that they need more money to make things work, even as Hosea is warning him about the train that they are about to rob. The man who owns the train is one Leviticus Cornwall, an oil magnate who doesn't mess around when it comes to his money. If robbing the ferry put them on the map with the law, robbing Cornwall would be painting a bullseye that they wouldn't be able to shake. The warning falls on deaf ears, however, and the robbery goes on with only a couple of hiccups as the dynamite meant to stop the train fails and the gang has to improvise. They wind up getting away with some bearer bonds that could eventually be sold for cash, but once again, the mission is mostly a fruitless endeavor. And if you really think about it, out of the 5 missions that we've seen in Chapter 1, 3 involved Dutch, and none of those really gained us anything, while the 2 that didn't involve him saved one member of the group's life and scored some food to help the gang survive. We know that the gang is perfectly capable of surviving, getting their own food and making enough money to get by without breaking any laws. We've seen that even this early on. So what's the point of following Dutch and remaining as outlaws? As the snow melts and the gang makes their way east into the rising sun, the air isn't the only thing heating up. Chapter 1 showed us the gang's strengths and potential weaknesses, but Chapter 2 is where we start to see the first cracks in the foundation. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're leaving the mountains and heading east in Red Dead Redemption 2 as we settle down in Horseshoe Overlook. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to that playlist so that you can find them all in one place. Fool's Gold refers to several different minerals that resemble gold at a glance. Someone who didn't know any better could gather up a pile of something like pyrite, thinking they'd hit the jackpot, only to have their hopes dashed when they try to sell it and make their fortune. In the same way, Dutch Vanderland is trying to build his fortune and future on false promises and a cracked foundation. As we start Chapter 2 of Red Dead Redemption 2, the snow and ice have started to melt, giving the Vanderland gang the perfect chance to start anew. Things haven't been easy for them over the past few weeks, but as they head east, they are focused on making money and finding a place to call home. In the short term, they settle into a place called Horseshoe Overlook, near the small livestock town of Valentine, masquerading as itinerant factory workers and looking for any opportunity they can find. The contrast from the cold, mountainous terrain of the Grizzlies to the peaceful, warm hills and valleys of New Hanover couldn't be greater. There's a sense of hope in the air, and everyone seems to be more upbeat. But there are cracks hiding just below the surface. The first sign we see of a potential problem for Dutch comes in the form of Hosea questioning him as they arrive in their new camp. The botched ferry job brought a lot of heat down on them, and Hosea thinks Dutch made the wrong call to even attempt it. He and Arthur were apparently working on some big job in Blackwater when Dutch and Micah got wrapped up in robbing the ferry and ruined everything. Dutch doesn't like being questioned, and instead of addressing Hosea's concerns, he deflects and focuses on his plan to make more money and head back west at some unknown time in the future. Hosea isn't the only one questioning Dutch, though, as we even see Arthur mention in his journal entry at the start of the chapter that Dutch seemed to be thinking a little clearer since arriving in Horseshoe Overlook. This implies that he suspects the man hadn't been in his right mind for a while, and shows the first hints of Arthur realizing something isn't right with his mentor. That aside, the early part of the chapter is peppered with missions that provide better introductions to some of the characters that we've only briefly interacted with. Arthur and Uncle take a trip into Valentine with Karen, Tilly, and Mary Beth to scope out the town and see what kind of trouble they might be able to get in. This is our first chance to see what kind of misdeeds the gang might partake in, with Mary Beth providing information on a potential train robbery, while Tilly and Karen are off working on robbing men drunk enough to allow it. While Mary Beth may have been successful in her endeavor, Tilly and Karen weren't so lucky, and both need a little help from Arthur to get out of bad situations. Once they've been saved, we get a reminder of the gang's overall situation in the form of a man named Jimmy Brooks. Mr. Brooks was apparently in Blackwater when the gang robbed the ferry, and he recognizes Arthur. Now, the smart thing to do if you've just recognized someone that you know is part of a dangerous gang would be to go straight to the local law and let them know. The last thing that you would want would be for the gang members to know that you know who they are, because that would put your life in danger. But Jimmy Brooks isn't the brightest bulb in the box. He calls out Arthur, telling him he recognizes him before riding off as if he has any chance of escaping an outlaw who's been able to avoid the best law enforcement agencies in the land for years. When Arthur inevitably catches up to him, he has fallen off his horse and finds himself stuck between a drop that would kill him and a man who might just do the same. As Arthur, we have a decision to make. It's one of the few moral decisions we actually have in this game. Should we save Jimmy Brooks, pulling him up and risking him exposing us to the law, or should we let him fall to his death? Now, I asked you all on the community tab here on YouTube what you would do, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that most of the community would choose to spare the man and hope that he stays quiet. I've been trying to post a bit more over there, using your responses to plan future content and to help push everyone to think a bit deeper about the high-level concepts we explore in these videos, so make sure you keep an eye out for posts asking for your thoughts. As a general rule, outlaws live by their own code. They shoot who they want, take what they want, and the rest of the world can just burn. But the Vanderlinde gang has traditionally been a little more forgiving. At the start, for instance, Dutch preached that they should only take from the rich and give back to the poor wherever possible. They weren't to kill anyone unless it was strictly necessary, and they were to focus on doing good overall, despite the propensity for breaking the law. Some of that attitude has fallen away over the years, but one thing that doesn't really change much is that killing should be limited to only when it is necessary, and letting Jimmy Brooks fall isn't strictly necessary. He isn't a threat to the gang or Arthur, even if he does go to the law. He hasn't fired a single shot or threatened to, and while we could easily argue that saving him is the moral thing to do, it would also be the right thing to do according to the gang's code. And having that code, as well as following it, is important because it balances the law-breaking and gives us a moral argument to make when we are confronted with those who disagree with our way of life. While laws may be black and white, morality isn't so simple. For instance, stealing food would be breaking the law and could land us in jail. But stealing food to feed starving people who otherwise wouldn't have anything to eat could be considered the morally right thing to do. In the same way, killing another person would be considered breaking the law, but killing that person to prevent them from doing harm to someone else or to another group could be seen as moral. We talked a bit about the moral high ground in a recent video, and while it might not save us from any consequences, Having the advantage of being able to say that we did the right thing helps us when arguing for leniency, even in a court of law. A judge might be willing to go a little easier on us if we're caught doing something illegal, but have shown a history of doing those things for morally justifiable reasons. After saving and sparing Jimmy Brooks's life, Arthur gets better acquainted with the locals in the bar before taking a hunting trip with Hosea, where we get a little backstory on the gang and a lesson on tracking legendary animals. That lesson ends with Hosea giving Arthur a map of where to find some of the most difficult animals to hunt after nearly being eaten by a legendary bear, but it also gives us a hint of even more cracks in the foundation of the gang as the pair return to camp. Arthur mentions to Hosea how he hopes Dutch doesn't hassle them for being away, as he's tired of hearing lectures about how they should all be focused non-stop on making money for the gang. And Hosea suggests that they lie by omission, telling Dutch they were out scoping a lead, but not mentioning that it was a big furry one. The fact that Hosea would suggest lying to Dutch, in addition to arguing with him earlier about the ferry job, hints at some major rifts forming between the pair. Not every outing is a chance to bond with members of the gang, though, as this chapter also includes the start of the loan sharking missions. Leopold Strauss, one of the less likable members of the gang, runs what he sees as a banking operation, where he loans out money to desperate individuals at extremely high interest rates before sending Arthur to collect on the debt at a later time. Out of all of the things the gang does to make money, this operation might well be the worst. For one thing, it goes against the idea the gang started on, helping the poor at the expense of the rich. Loan sharking is hurting the poor and the desperate, taking advantage of people who found themselves in situations they can't get out of. Many of them needed money to pay off other debts, and were more than happy to borrow from the slippery Strauss, who likely made the offer seem like some kind of amazing opportunity. And the activity is made all the worse when Arthur has to recover the debts using violence as a tool to get the money back. I'll cover the missions themselves in a separate video at some point, because they are rather fun despite the moral implications. But I bring them up here to highlight the breadth of the gang's activities and to lay the foundation for the conversation we'll have later on about Arthur in Chapter 6. I also need to mention them because one of the recovery missions Strauss has you do involves a man known as Thomas Downs. He's someone we met briefly outside the bar in Valentine when he stopped us from beating Tommy in the muddy street, though the first time we actually see him, he's manning a donations for the poor table near the stables in Valentine. Arthur refers to him as an opinionated little do-gooder and says that he'll look into recovering the debt, sealing his eventual fate in the process. See, Thomas Downs is sick, very sick in fact, and in addition to not being long for this world, he also has no assets to speak of. The first question we need to ask here is why in the world Strauss would be lending money to someone who is dying and broke. Maybe he didn't know Thomas's full condition, but that just makes things worse because it means he isn't vetting the people he's lending to very well. And that's one of the less obvious cracks in the gang. Strauss is allowed to just go out and lend money to people, with the only chance of recovering the debt often lying in the hands of Arthur, who risks his life every time he tracks down one of the debtors. Strauss doesn't have any way of knowing if the people he is lending to will be able to pay back the loans, as even under the threat of violence you can only recover what the person has available. Now, we never get to see the actual finances for the gang, so maybe he is ultimately making some money through this loan sharking operation. But considering the risk involved and the fact that it goes against everything the gang is supposed to stand for, Dutch should have put a stop to it before it even started. And that begs the question, what other operations are ongoing that Dutch doesn't know about? He is obviously not worried too much about who is doing what and how they are earning their keep, meaning there isn't really a standard. While some members might be partaking in more noble crimes like loan sharking or other scam operations, there's the very real possibility that members like Micah, for instance, would be inclined to do something like rob an orphanage or steal from a blind man on the side of the road as ways to make money. The gang may not be the most angelic of crews, but they should at least have some standards. Heading back out after recovering the first debt and confronting Thomas Downs about the money he owes, Arthur winds up on a couple of recovery missions. The first involves saving Reverend Swanson from some demons and deadly sins, and the second takes Arthur back to the outskirts of Blackwater to find one of the gang members that wasn't able to escape with the rest of them. Sean McGuire is one of the rowdier men in the group, but that didn't help him in any way when it came to escaping the law. The mission to recover him involves shooting a lot of bounty hunters, but it also contains a couple of snippets that are easily overlooked and tell a bit about the structure and love the gang has for its own people. As Arthur is lying on an overlook with Charles and Javier, he notes that they will either need to free Sean now or leave him behind. The statement is framed as if there is an option, and almost as if Arthur is actually willing to consider cutting Sean loose. But Charles isn't having that discussion and firmly says there isn't a choice to be made at all, as they don't leave people behind. While Arthur may not really be the type to abandon his allies, this does present an interesting conundrum for the group, as they have to carefully navigate the mission if they want any chance of saving the young man. They are outnumbered, with the bounty hunters having a large group of men to contend with, and the chances of any or all of them being killed in the rescue attempt are high. In a real situation, going after Sean would be nothing short of a kamikaze mission, and the gang would wind up with 3 fewer pairs of hands, as Arthur, Javier, and Charles were all taken out by the larger group. They might be sharpshooters, but so are the men they're trying to take down. A stealth mission into the camp once it's been located might be worth a shot if they really want to try, but the smarter move here would actually be to go with Arthur's original suggestion and just let Sean be taken to prison. And going against those odds, while being so firmly against leaving the boy, tells us just how strong the ties are in the group. Charles, Javier, and even Arthur are all willing to die in a situation where that outcome is the most likely one than to leave someone to rot in the hands of the state. Rescuing Sean brings another member of the gang back into the fold, and shortly after that mission, we find the gang starting to expand further as the O'Driscoll member that we picked up in Chapter 1, Kieran Duffy, leads Arthur and a few others to one of the O'Driscoll's hideouts. Colm isn't there, but it's a chance to take out a few more of our rival gang members and get a new rifle in the process. Expanding the money-making opportunities even further as well, Arthur meets up with Hosea, who secured a fence to help the gang get rid of unwanted things like stolen property and stagecoaches. His name is Seamus, and his biggest concern is whether he can trust the gang or not. The pair of outlaws proves their mettle by stealing a stagecoach and a couple $100 without firing a single shot, making us wonder what kind of job Hosea might have been cooking up in Blackwater and how much smoother it might have gone than the ferry job. It's a crack that I think is worth pointing out because this mission in particular shows the contrast between the level-headed, well-planned opportunities for making money that can go in the gang's favor and the missions Dutch typically has us on. As we saw in Coulter, the missions Dutch puts together really don't wind up panning out very well in the end, while the others seem to go a lot better, even when they don't always go as planned. If Dutch were to slow down and put some thought and care into his planning, the gang might be able to retire in Tahiti sooner rather than later. But we're kind of putting the cart before the horse. Back at camp, Arthur and Dutch discuss the finer points of being on the run from the law, with Dutch assuring Arthur that they are smarter than the government forces that are hunting them down. He seems to be going on the assumption that only the weak and stupid among the population take jobs in the government, and that is another major crack in his philosophy, showing in the form of hubris. Hubris is often highlighted through the story of Icarus, the son of Daedalus in the Greek story of the Labyrinth. He flew too close to the sun using wings his father fashioned out of metal feathers, a leather frame, and beeswax, causing the beeswax to melt away and sending him crashing to the earth as the feathers held together by the wax fell apart. Dutch believes he can outsmart and outrun anyone that might be tailing him, and while he constantly reminds everyone that he has the gang's best interest in mind, his actions don't show that. As the conversation wraps up, Lenny stumbles into camp to let Dutch know that Micah has been arrested in Strawberry, and Dutch's first reaction is to have Arthur take Lenny into Valentine to get drunk. Now, while this might just be the dumbest thing that Dutch could have proposed, the real catch in the conversation is when Arthur suggests that they should leave Micah to hang. This is the second time Arthur has proposed leaving someone behind, and the first time it's been someone that we'd already met. We have to wonder how committed Arthur truly is if he's suggesting leaving people to their fate so often. The night out with Lenny ends in a jail cell, unless you're quick enough to hit the right button and escape the law. And the next morning brings us to the town of Strawberry, where Arthur has to figure out a way to free Micah from a date with the gallows. This is a chore that many people try to put off until later, but it's one that has to be done. Even so, it's another crack in the foundation, as we know Micah is a loose cannon. Even without any prior knowledge of what comes later, he was the reason that Dutch decided to do the ferry job. Arthur and Lenny also talk about how unhinged he is as they ride to Valentine, with Lenny not even sure how Micah had managed to shoot the man in Strawberry that led to him being arrested. Having someone like that in your group is a recipe for trouble. And the fact that Dutch would be swayed by him, following his leads over the more level-headed members like Hosea, is setting the group up for failure in the long term. The jobs they take on should be as low risk and high reward as possible, and Micah doesn't seem to be someone capable of finding those kind of jobs. Even as Arthur is freeing him from jail, he's rampaging through town, taking out lawmen needlessly on a mission to get a pair of guns back from one of the town's residents. This isn't the action of someone with a level head on their shoulders, and he isn't someone who's helping the gang in any way. So far, anything involving Micah or Dutch seems to lead to a worse position for the gang overall, and the contrast doesn't get much better as we help John steal some sheep and rob our second train of the game. These missions, like the jobs Hosea comes to us with, are planned out and at least net us a little cash, if nothing else, at the end of the day. But another mission, a fishing trip with John's son Jack, marks the beginning of the end of Chapter 2, as Arthur is confronted by Agent Milton and Agent Ross from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They're hunting for Dutch, and they're even willing to offer Arthur a chance at freedom in exchange for information on the gang's leader. And the conversation they have highlights one of the biggest themes we see in the game: society versus the Wild West, the new way of doing things versus the old way. Milton says he enjoys society, despite its flaws, even as the Vanderlyn gang seeks freedom and the ability to live outside of those constraints. And that is another flaw in the foundation for Dutch and the gang, as there is really no way out for them at this point, and that should be obvious to any leader that actually knows what they're doing. The law is coming down on those who continue to fight, and the plans that Dutch keeps putting out to make more money and head west just dig them deeper and make the lawmen more desperate to hunt them down. They started in a deep hole, with the law being sent after them following the death of the young girl on the ferry in Blackwater. Then they robbed Cornwall's train, despite the pleas of Hosea, which brought even more pressure as the magnate joined the pursuit by throwing money at the Pinkertons. And now the pressure has hit an even higher mark as the law has followed them through the mountains and into the more civilized east. If they had fled west out of Blackwater, they might have stood a chance, with fewer people in cities, meaning less chance of running into the law. But they went into the teeth of the very thing they were running from. They could have easily set up a ranch out west, somewhere quiet, where they could grow food and ride their horses in peace, though that might have made for a less exciting game. Dutch manages to keep his cool this time when he finds out about the encounter Arthur had while fishing, even making the good decision to stay put in the short term as he realizes the agents were trying to rile up the gang and force them into making another bad decision. But that calm and cool doesn't last as Arthur, Dutch, John, and Strauss wind up in a firefight with Leviticus Cornwall's men in Valentine. First of all, hats off to Cornwall for showing up and at least pretending like he is willing to get his hands dirty, as most wealthy business moguls wouldn't know the first thing about doing their own dirty work. He might be a despicable piece of trash, but at least he's willing to ride into town and call out Dutch in person. That might seem a bit harsh, but as we'll discuss in future episodes, people like Cornwall might have a ton of money and power, but none of that buys them the things that truly matter in this life, and it tends to make them into nothing more than husks that eat up all of the resources and smack the less fortunate for daring to even ask for crumbs. Strauss is shot as they escape Valentine, and the ruckus is enough to force Dutch's hand and make the gang seek a new camp further east. As usual, Dutch takes Micah's suggestion, pointing out a place that Micah suggested as a place that they could lie low. And, as usual, that suggestion was utterly horrible. The original site is mostly in an exposed creek bed that might be an awful spot if it rained. Not only that, Arthur and Charles arrived there to find the remnants of a camp with a woman and her 2 children who were apparently hiding from some bandits that had taken their father. The search for the man leads them to a spot that works a lot better as a camp. And as the sun sets on Chapter 2, we find ourselves on the humid shores of Flatiron Lake. And while our time in Valentine showed us the cracks in the foundation of the Vanderlyn gang, our first taste of real civilization in Rhodes will highlight a new problem as we find out society isn't much better. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're saddling up and continuing the march east in Red Dead Redemption 2 as the Vanderlyn gang makes camp at Clemens Point. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Clemens Point might just be the highest point of the Vanderlyn gang's flight toward the sun. They only barely escaped the law near Valentine, having at least one person shot as they fled, and it was only through the mere chance that they were able to find a good enough spot to stay hidden from the Pinkertons in Lemoyne. As the chapter opens, we find Dutch and Arthur arguing about the state of things, very similar to how Dutch and Hosea started in Chapter 2. Arthur is worried about the direction Dutch is taking the gang, how they've been losing people, and how they can't seem to catch a break. Dutch counters Arthur's worries in a very similar manner to how he countered Hosea, by pointing out their goals and even saying that some sacrifices will have to be made as they work to achieve those goals. But Dutch's goals aren't really too clear here. Most of what he's been focused on up to this point revolved around making money and getting the gang somewhere safe. But as he talks to Arthur now, he insists they are trying to reform society to a kinder, truer, better way. The initial focus of the gang, way back when it first started, was supposedly around helping people and making a better world. But nothing we've seen Dutch do to this point would show that he is focused on anything outside of the gang. From the ferry robbery to the train robbery and everything that happened in Valentine, Dutch has been laser focused on the gang and only the gang. Or at least that's what he tells us. Let's be real, the choice to rob the ferry in the first place wasn't smart, and going after Cornwall's train in the mountains was about the worst decision that he could have made in the moment. If he was really focused on the gang, he wouldn't have put them in so much danger. They've lost Davy, Mac, and Jenny, nearly lost John and Sean, and could easily have frozen or starved to death in Coulter. Despite his overall history, Dutch hasn't really been a good leader in recent months. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur ride off to explore their new surroundings, with the promise of a day of fishing to look forward to. But as we well know, anything involving Dutch is going to be a bit more complicated than that. A short way into the ride, they come across a stopped train and a couple of local lawmen with a wagon full of what are presumably criminals. And one of the criminals just so happens to be Josiah Trelawney. He showed up in Chapter 2 as well, with information on Sean's whereabouts, and this time he is in need of our help. Dutch is able to distract the lawman driving the wagon long enough for one of the captives to pick the lock and get the door open, and Arthur is tasked with helping one of the deputies recover the prisoners as they run off. It turns out the men in the wagon with Trelawney are part of a local gang known as the Anderson Boys. And once Arthur and the deputy have stopped them and secured the leader of the group on Arthur's horse, the pair ride into Rhodes to lock the man away once more. The whole situation winds up ingratiating Dutch, Arthur, and Hosea with Sheriff Gray, a member of one of the two rival main families that call Rhodes home. And the ride back to Rhodes is where we find out the first snippets about the families: the Grays and the Braithwaites. Both families own a lot of land, and they each claim to have a large fortune to their name. There's a feud between them, some pre-Civil War era hatred that has gone on for decades, and Dutch immediately focuses on learning as much about both families as possible. We can guess pretty early on that he will be aiming to steal something from each family, as their supposed wealth is just too much to pass up. But these warring families don't just give us someone to try and rob. They provide a peek into high society and show us that while the outlaw gangs may be on the way out, the outlaw way of life isn't really dying so much as it is changing. Gangs like the Vanderlyns thrive on chaos, robbing people and breaking laws they don't like in an attempt to stay free and live however they see fit. Families like the Grays and the Braithwaites, however, are more sophisticated gangs, bending the law to their will through power and influence. This allows them to thrive and avoid the pitfalls of running with an outlaw gang while enjoying the lifestyle that comes with that way of life. The Grays are the law in Rhodes, with Sheriff Gray calling the shots, and they own many of the local businesses, while the Braithwaites have their hand in more illicit endeavors, garnering support from the locals who don't like the way that the Grays run things. But the external family feud isn't the only focus in the chapter, as an internal feud is brewing within the Vanderlyn gang. Where Horseshoe Overlook almost felt like a new beginning, with a beautiful view and warmer weather, Clemens Point is hot and muggy, and tempers are starting to show. The first indication of a problem with this camp comes from Sadie and Pearson, who seemingly can't stand each other, as Sadie fights to do more than just act as Pearson's assistant. She's not happy being stuck at camp, and Arthur helps alleviate some of the tension by taking her into town to shop for supplies. The whole thing wouldn't be too much more than a blip on the radar, except for the introduction on the way back to the camp to the Lemoyne Raiders. The Raiders are a group of bandits who never got over the Civil War, and who think the South is still fighting. They rob and terrorize people all throughout Lemoyne, and quite frankly, I'm surprised they exist at all. I mean, it's just so unrealistic that a group of people who lost a war like that would still be claiming victory and crying about how they didn't really lose and were going to rise up again someday. With all the attention to detail Rockstar gave this game, I can't believe that bit slipped through the cracks. Sarcasm aside, the little trip into town helps Sadie's mood, and Arthur moves on to bigger things, like jumping into the southern retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Dutch asks Arthur to look into the Grays, and the very first person he meets upon visiting their estate, aside from some very grumpy guards, is Beau Gray, the nephew of the sheriff. He seems to be pretty level-headed, all things considered, calling out what he sees as the obvious plan the Vanderlyn gang has to take advantage of the families, while also asking for Arthur's help to deliver a letter to the woman he loves, Penelope Braithwaite. Penelope is a little more difficult to reach, as the Braithwaites apparently have their property a lot more locked down than the Greys, but delivering the letter and gift Beau provided gets us a foot in the door there as well. And the relationship between Penelope and Beau is more than just a romantic storyline. It's a mirror in a lot of ways to the fight the Vanderlyn gang is facing with the encroachment of society and the rule of law on their way of life. On the one hand, you have the older and more dedicated members of the Greys and Braithwaites, fighting an old battle and holding tightly onto a way of doing things that doesn't make sense. Most of them can't even remember which side started the feud, or explain why they hate each other so much. They just cling to it like their lives depend on it. In the same way, the Vanderlyn gang is clinging to an outdated way of life that really doesn't make a lot of sense. They have to live every day wondering if some other gang or the law is going to take them out. And they have to worry every time they go anywhere close to other groups of people if they're going to be recognized. Most of them couldn't even give a solid reason, outside of freedom or riches, as to why they are outlaws. And they've had chances to melt into society, with several members of the gang drifting in and out of the life over the years, but they always come back like it's some kind of drug. And that's juxtaposed with the law, or new way of doing things, that threatens the life they know. The Pinkertons, and society writ large, are a direct threat to their way of doing things in the same way that the relationship between Beau and Penelope is a threat to the feud between the Greys and the Braithwaites. If Beau and Penelope are allowed to be together, it means the feud might die off, and most of the other members of each family wouldn't know what to do if that happened. In the same way, some members of the Vanderlyn gang would likely be fine if they had to reintegrate into society, but many wouldn't know how to survive if the daily fight for survival wasn't there. And the old way versus the new way theme exists in more places, as we assist Beau and Penelope with another situation where Penelope is joining a group of women protesting for the right to vote. Arthur winds up as a wagon driver as the group parades through the streets of Rhodes, and we see several people coming out to jeer as they roll along. Personally, this was one of the more fun missions for me, as I was wrapped up in the history of the moment. U.S. history is one of my favorite subjects overall, and to be able to ride into something that would have been very similar to a protest in the real-life women's suffrage movement is actually kind of cool. My fangirling over the history in a video game aside, the only real point of note in the story overall here is how Beau seems to cast some doubt on whether either family has the money they are rumored to have. He and Arthur leave the suffrage protest after his cousins show up to hassle him for being there, and as they are getting ready to part ways, he mentions that the rumors of the Braithwaites having Yankee gold may be nothing more than a story. At the same time, he also admits that he isn't entirely sure of his own family's financial situation either. And we're left to wonder whether this whole thing is going to be even worth it if both families are secretly broke. And we get a little more background on the families and their feud from the deputy, Archibald, as Arthur, Bill, and Dutch, who have been officially deputized by Sheriff Gray, accompany him to take down one of the Braithwaites' moonshine stills. Archibald seems to be under the impression that any gold may be long gone, saying that both families claim the other stole it at some point in the past. So we've got two families here, both of whom claim to be wealthy and who both hate the other with a passion. They've both obviously got some money, or at least some value, in the fact that they own land and have big houses with servants, and that right there is something to focus on for a minute. They might both be, for all intents and purposes, broke. Not broke like you and I might think, where we struggle to pay the rent or buy groceries, but broke from a rich person's perspective, where they have the appearance of wealth while simultaneously not actually having any real currency. They live in a form of high society, but only because they are able to keep up appearances in the community. They have the power and control over the important pieces, like the law and criminal enterprises, but that power is a very carefully woven mirage. And while that seems at first glance like a problem, it's actually a common thing even in the real world when it comes to wealthy individuals and families. Most people think that the wealthy in society are simply chasing wealth for the sake of having more money. But in reality, while many wealthy families certainly have a lot of money, what they really seek is power, because money can only get you so far. Sure, money can buy you nice things and allow you to hire servants and security, but one can only have so many nice cars and houses before adding to those collections gets boring. So they chase the one thing that is more desirable than gold: power. Families like the Grays and the Braithwaites wouldn't need to have mountains of gold if they had control over the local population. They could even sell some of that control to outside entities, leveraging a stake in local affairs for status in other places like nearby Saint Denis. But we can't go that far just yet, as we still have some robbing to do around roads. Arthur, Dutch, and Bill successfully shut down the moonshine still and wind up confiscating the spoils in the form of a wagon full of moonshine. That moonshine gives them an in at the Braithwaites' place, as Hosea comes up with the brilliant idea of selling it back to the people they stole it from. Under most circumstances, Catherine Braithwaite, the matron of the Braithwaite family, would likely shoot anyone that brazen on sight. But she seems to take a liking to Hosea, and she seems to think that the whole situation is an opportunity to get one up on the Grays. Not only does she agree to pay the men for returning the shine, but she offers them a little extra to take the load into town and give it away at the bar. That plan works out for the most part, at least until some Lemoyne Raiders show up and shut the party down. They were apparently planning to buy the liquor from the Braithwaites, and they aren't happy that someone else got to it first. And can I just say how insane this whole situation is? On one side, we have a family that is literally above the law, running the sheriff's office and half the businesses in town. And on the other, we have one that is not only in bed with a gang of raiders that makes the Vanderlyn gang look docile, but is also tied to or running most of the criminal elements in the state. And I'm not the only one who notices how wild Rhodes is, as Dutch and Micah both see it too. As Arthur returns from his wild night at the bar as a bartender, he's clued into the latest plan, as Micah has once again gotten into Dutch's head and convinced him that robbing both families blind is a good idea. And like all of Dutch's plans, this one is just horrible and will never really pay off the way that they think it will. We have a mountain of evidence that neither family has the riches they claim, but none of that matters when it comes to Dutch Vanderlyn's incessant drive to have all of the money in the world. At this point, I think the gang could successfully rob every bank, ferry, and family from Saint Denis to New Austin, and Dutch would still be complaining that they need more money. And there is no shortage of ways to make money, as Bill, Karen, and Lenny convince Arthur to go with them back to Valentine to rob the bank. It's one of those things that they feel is important to do in every town, but that they weren't able to complete before all hell broke loose, and they had to leave. Robbing the bank is really a cover, however, for the return to the Downs Ranch at the behest of Strauss. He tells Arthur that Mr. Downs has died and says that means that Mrs. Downs assumes the debt. Ethically speaking, this is an abhorrent practice that even happens in some cases in the modern world. When a person dies, the debt they accrued in life can sometimes be passed on to their surviving spouse or children, though how much and what kind of debt can be passed is based on where you live, as different states have different rules about it. And that's one of those areas where we talk about legality versus ethicality. There are a lot of things that are unethical, but wind up being legal because laws are often written by those with enough money to make anything happen. We talked earlier about how the Greys run the law in Rhodes, meaning that the laws are based on whatever works best for them. If, for instance, they only wanted certain types of liquor sold locally, a brand that came from a company they owned or worked closely with, while banning certain other types like moonshine brewed by a family they don't like, they could make that law. And that doesn't just apply to local bands of crooked families. It extends nationwide when we look at people like Leviticus Cornwall. Cornwall was able to march into Valentine in the last chapter and have his men get into a shootout with the Vanderlyn gang, putting innocent lives at risk in the process, with no repercussions. He is rich enough to buy politicians and make the law bend to his will, and he is used to getting what he wants. And that's the kind of thing I think the Dutch and the gang are running away from at the end of the day. Sure, laws restricting freedom are frustrating, but when those laws are written by men who don't have to follow the law themselves, it's only natural that there would be groups of people like the Vanderlyn gang that refuse to go along. The Greys, the Braithwaites, and Cornwall are all examples of people living the life that Dutch Vanderlyn wants to live, having the ability to do what they want when they want. But as we finish the Valentine bank robbery and return to camp, we have to question how much money Dutch thinks the gang needs. That job alone brings in $10,000 for the gang savings, adding to whatever else has been contributed through other jobs, and meaning the gang has the modern equivalent of almost $400,000 in cash in a box stashed outside the camp. That should be more than enough to head west and buy some land, as Dutch proposed in an earlier conversation. As a real-world example of how much land could potentially be bought in 1899 and how much it would cost, I found a 300-acre tract of land in Colorado selling for $25 an acre. That would total about $7,500, which falls well within the gang's budget and is more than enough land for them to start a life on. And don't even get me started on how the gang could retrieve the money that they left in Blackwater using stealth and members of the Pinkertons aren't as familiar with to do so, adding to the overall total and making their dreams of disappearing easily accessible. The only thing preventing them from doing this, as usual, is Dutch. As we chase his imaginary pot of gold throughout Lemoyne, Arthur, John, and Javier end up stealing some horses from the Braithwaites, and Arthur works with Sean to burn the Greys' tobacco fields, as both families are brought to their knees. But these crimes won't go unpunished. Just when the gang thinks they've got the upper hand in the feud between the families, they are blindsided by an attack in Rhodes from the sheriff and a large contingent of Greys who finally caught on to their shenanigans. Sean pays the highest price for the recent acts as he's shot in the head before Arthur, Bill, and Micah clear the town of residents. This might be the worst moment for the gang since Blackwater, except things get worse as Arthur rides back to camp to find out that John's son, Jack, has been taken by the Braithwaites. All the king's horses and all the king's men ride off into the night in what might very well be one of the most badass moments in the game as the gang lays siege to the Braithwaite estate in search of the boy. There is an incredible amount of resistance as every inbred farmer for miles around rallies to the mansion before the gang finally drags old Ma Braithwaite from the burning house to reveal that Jack has been sent to Saint Denis and left in the care of a man named Angelo Bronte. Leaving the old woman to her fate, the group rides back to camp to prepare for the next steps, only to find themselves being accosted by agents Milton and Ross. Now, this moment really says a lot about both the gang and the Pinkerton agents. Milton offers every member of the gang the chance to escape if Dutch goes quietly with them into custody. Logically, Milton and Ross could have invaded the camp with 100 men if they really wanted to, taking no prisoners and putting an end to the gang's existence in one foul swoop. but he chooses instead to try and reason with them. He is supposedly the bad guy, the one that the gang is supposed to fear, and yet he is showing them way more mercy than some of them probably deserve. Dutch stands up and offers to go with them, but the gang comes to his defense, with everyone pulling their guns and aiming at the agents without even a second thought. On the surface, Dutch offering himself up would seem like a moment of bravery, like he was actually willing to give himself up to save the gang. But the reality isn't that simple. Dutch knew they would stand up for him. He spent years brainwashing them into his way of thinking and doing things, and he knows that every one of them would be willing to die for each other and for him. If he truly wanted what was best, if he actually cared for them the way that he pretends, he would tell them to lower their weapons and allow himself to be arrested and face the consequences of his actions. The rest of the gang would be free to go their separate ways or stick together, and so long as they were integrated into society, it's likely they would all fare well in the long term. And he has no reason to think the agents would go back on their word, as this is the second time they've approached the gang with offers of freedom, though it's the first time they've visited the camp. They really only want Dutch because he's the leader and the one that killed the girl on the ferry. Taking him down takes away the driving force for some of the more horrific things the gang has done and brings justice to a lot of people. But of course, Dutch would never give himself up to save anyone. Despite his claim from the very first chapter that,
"Now, if I could throw myself in the ground in their stead, I'd do it gladly,"
he isn't the type to actually go through with that promise when it counts. With the Pinkertons knowing their location and a missing boy to deal with, the gang packs up and makes their way to a spot not too far away that Arthur and Lenny discovered a few weeks back, called Shady Belle. It's a run-down, old building that was likely once as beautiful as any other plantation house in the area, and it serves as the home base for the next chapter of the Vanderlyn gang's story. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're setting camp in an old plantation house alongside the Vanderlyn gang as we dissect Chapter 4 of Red Dead Redemption 2, Saint Denis. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. After failing to rob the Greys and the Braithwaites, and coming face to face with the Pinkerton detectives, the Vanderlyn gang flees still further east, into the swamps on the outskirts of Saint Denis. They set up camp in an old, run-down plantation house known as Shady Belle, where the mosquitoes are as big as the birds and the gators are meaner than Dutch when Molly O'Shea is around. Before Arthur can even settle into the new camp, however, Dutch summons him for a journey into the big city, and we get our first glimpse of what Dutch refers to as the eighth wonder of the civilized world. Saint Denis at first glance is the exact opposite of the idyllic West the gang has been pining for. It's dirty, polluted, and full of people. But under the surface, it has a lot in common with the lawless frontier, as long as you're friendly with the right people. And speaking of the right people to be friendly with, the first order of business for the gang in Saint Denis is to track down a man by the name of Angelo Bronte. Bronte is the strong man that Catherine Braithwaite said her boys gave Jack to, but he isn't an easy man to find. Arthur starts by asking around at a local bar, being quickly directed to a group of kids in a nearby alleyway that apparently work for him. Getting the information out of the boys isn't easy though, as they try to rob Arthur and lead him on a chase through the streets and alleys before he finally catches up to them in what appears to be some kind of gang hideout spot. After a little chat, he's given the location of Bronte's mansion by what appears to be the child equivalent of a mob enforcer. And this is our first introduction to the criminal underbelly of Saint Denis. For much of the game, and even in real life, there is an assumption that civilization equals law and order. The basic idea is that living in a city or town should mean some kind of protection from the larger criminal elements. You might get mugged or assaulted, but the law will swoop in and save the day, holding the assailant responsible and serving justice. This idea is the backbone of society. Equal justice under the law is the glue that holds things together. But in both Saint Denis and our own real world, this isn't exactly the case. We saw the first glimpse of corruption in the system with the Greys in Chapter 3. One family owned the law, allowing those they liked a lot of leeway and slamming their fists down on those who would dare to cross them. In Saint Denis, it isn't one family, it's one man. Angelo Bronte is in charge of everything, having everyone from the mayor to the police in his pocket. Nothing happens in the city without his say-so, and no one comes or goes without him knowing. And we can see this in action the first time Dutch, John, and Arthur meet him. He's been expecting their visit, and he's waiting comfortably in his sitting room as they arrive. Dutch is his usual self, acting tough and playing it up as if he has the upper hand, but the whole thing was carefully orchestrated so that Bronte could get a peek at just who this gang is. He is well aware of their activities in Rhodes, as he'd been one of the big benefactors of the Braithwaite's liquor business, and he wants to put the Vanderlyn gang to work for him to make up for their actions in taking down the families. He and Dutch also share a lot of traits, but there's a massive difference between them. Dutch sees Angelo Bronte as nothing more than just some pompous prick with low intelligence, someone he can easily manipulate in the same way he manipulated the Greys, the Braithwaites, and even members of his own gang. He always thinks he's the smartest person in the room, and so far he's been able to get away with that assumption as he's not run across anyone that had the power or ability to call him out or turn the tables. Bronte sees Dutch for what he is, a con artist who thinks he's got things figured out, and he knows that Dutch is a sucker for flattery. He's been watching the gang, and Dutch, for a while, and he knows just how to press the right buttons to get Dutch's attention and cooperation. He knows, for instance, that Dutch craves money and power, the kind of money and power that he, Bronte, has. And he shows off that power by convincing Dutch to send John and Arthur on a job for him. Something simple and something he's prearranged especially for them. The two men are to go to the cemetery and stop some grave robbers who've been stealing items from the dead and not paying tribute to him. He says that when the grave robbers see his men, they run off before they can be apprehended, and that having a couple of strangers there instead might allow them to be caught. The thing is, if he knew that grave robbing was an actual issue, you would think that he would have guards stationed at the cemetery to control access, or even have a police patrol on site, as he more or less owns the police department. This request is really just a way for Bronte to gauge the gang's capability and show off a little of the power that he wields in the city. And to an extent, there is evidence to support this idea. After a brief gunfight with the supposed grave robbers, we can loot several of their bodies before locating their stash, and they have a surprising amount of cash on them. For me, one had $18.22, another had $20.02, and the third was carrying $19.81. That doesn't sound like much, but that translates to a little over $2,200 in today's money, and that was just the cash they had on them. There was also a stash they had hidden in one of the crypts, a little bag that John and Arthur had to locate before going back to Bronte. Why would they have some of the stolen goods stored in a crypt while the rest was being carried on their person? You might argue that they brought the cash with them, but why? If you were going to do something illegal, why would you bring so much money with you? Then there's the fact that the grave robbers started shooting at John and Arthur when sneaking out quietly would have made much more sense. The men had just burst into a crypt, thinking they heard noises coming from inside, and the group with the stolen goods could have easily escaped with their treasure. But instead, they chose to open fire, giving away their location and drawing in police? That doesn't make any sense unless the whole thing was a setup orchestrated by Angelo Bronte. He likely hired or even encouraged the men to rob the cemetery that night, and he probably told the police to be ready for trouble to cover his bases. If John and Arthur could deal with the grave robbers and escape the police presence, they might just be of use to the crime lord. And as it turns out, Arthur and John are able to pass the test, recovering the loot and sneaking out as the police search the area. Returning to Bronte's mansion, John is reunited with his son as he, Dutch, and Arthur make their way back to camp to celebrate the boy's safe return. As we've moved further into civilization, we've started to see a pattern forming. The outlaws have become more sophisticated, going from gangs like the Vanderlyns and O'Driscolls running things in the West, to the faux high society of the Greys and the Braithwaites, and now into the political corruption of Saint Denis. This is another look at the past versus the future when it comes to how things work. Ethically speaking, there is really no difference between the Vanderlyns robbing a bank and someone like Angelo Bronte taking a cut of criminal activities like grave robbing or illicit liquor sales. But legally speaking, Bronte isn't going to have the Pinkertons knocking his door down anytime soon. But men like Bronte and even Leviticus Cornwall are seen as a necessary evil in society. They lie, cheat, and steal under the guise of doing those things to make life better for everyone. And they have the power and influence to get away with it. The common, middle or lower class individual in society has no recourse to stop them, as they control everything from the law to supply chains and even the very currency that most people exchange for goods and services. To go against them would mean throwing away the life that most people have become accustomed to. Most people, except the Vanderlyn gang and those like them, I mean. See, Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and the rest are actively resisting this new way of life. The one that the majority of people in Saint Denis, Rhodes, and other civilized locations have adopted. And that is the real reason they are being hunted. Not because they've robbed and murdered their way across the map, but because they didn't do those things in the morally acceptable way that society expects. But we're getting ahead of ourselves just a bit. With Jack safely back in camp, the gang takes some time to celebrate, before Arthur finds himself running out once more. This time to help Miss Grimshaw save Tilly Jackson from her old gang. Tilly used to run with a group known as the Foreman Brothers, and a few of them have been following her since at least back in Valentine. This mission might just be yet another in a long list of side missions, if not for the choice to spare or kill Anthony Foreman at the end of it. This is one of the few times in the game where we are actually given an option like this, and it bears at least a few moments of our time because an argument could be made for either decision. On the one hand, Miss Grimshaw is pushing us to slit the man's throat. As tough as she seems on the outside, she's actually very protective of the gang, seeing them as more or less her children, and she will rain down fire on anyone that messes with them. From that perspective, it makes some sense to leave no witnesses and take no prisoners, because it kind of sends a message to the others, letting them know what happens when you mess with the Vanderlyn gang or anyone in it. It also gets some retribution for any wrongs that they committed against Tilly, and stops Anthony Foreman, at least, from doing any further harm. On the other hand, Tilly says she would prefer him to be left alive to deliver a message to the rest of the Foreman gang to leave her alone. In her eyes, this seems like enough to ensure that they back off, and if our goal is to keep her and the rest of the gang safe, then getting them to stay away is all we need to focus on. We don't know much about them aside from what Tilly shares, so it makes sense to lean on her experience and assume that letting him live would be the best move. At the end of the day, there isn't really any fallout either way, But killing him seems like it would be the worst option here. He apparently came after Tilly for killing his cousin, and we can assume that he probably has some relatives that would be willing to risk coming after Arthur and the gang for revenge if he was killed. Ethically, the water here is rather murky because while he has likely done some pretty horrible things in his time, so has Arthur, meaning that Arthur really has no moral high ground to stand on when it comes to judging him. We could argue, through a moral system like utilitarianism, that removing Anthony Foreman from the world would be a net good, as it would prevent him from causing more harm in the long run. As we've discussed in previous episodes of this series, utilitarianism is an ethical philosophy that focuses on maximizing overall pleasure and happiness while minimizing pain and suffering. If Anthony Foreman brings more harm into the world than positivity, then killing him could be seen as an overall good from that viewpoint. But it's never really that simple. See, utilitarianism assumes that we can weigh the positive against the negative with some accuracy, but that's rarely the case. We don't know what Anthony Foreman's future might hold, or what taking him out of the picture might prevent. Maybe he'll wind up shooting someone at some point that was planning to burn a hospital full of children to the ground. And by killing him now, he isn't there to pull the trigger later and dozens of children die, leading to pain for them and their families for all of lives lost. If he was actually shooting at us, it would be a lot easier to justify killing him, as that action would actively prevent him from doing harm to us and or Tilly and Miss Grimshaw. We could look backward instead of forward to justify killing him, though. Despite Arthur's lack of moral standing, mentioned a moment ago, he isn't the one on trial here, and we, the players, are acting as the judge, jury, and executioner. So is there a moral philosophy that we could use to judge him that doesn't rely on what he might or might not do in the future? For that, we could look at a system like deontology. At a very high level, deontology looks at past actions and judges them based on the moral system used by society rather than looking at the impact. For instance, instead of looking at how kidnapping Tilly might have affected her and those who care about her, we would look at whether the action of kidnapping her is considered moral by the society or group in which he lived. This gets a little difficult in this situation because, on the one hand, the Foreman brothers gang might argue that it isn't kidnapping at all because she killed one of them before running off, and they were simply retrieving her in order to exact justice. Under a system like that, it could be argued that Arthur and Miss Grimshaw have a moral obligation to give Tilly up to the Foreman brothers, and that killing Anthony Foreman as he was in that pursuit is the wrong thing to do. And that's the thing about moral and philosophical systems that gets lost in most situations like this. There is no black and white answer about how to handle Anthony. Just like there is no one right answer about the nature of the Vanderlyn gang, or one right way to look at why what they do is right or wrong, while justifying or condemning the actions of people like Cornwall or Bronte. Right and wrong in society is decided by the people with enough power and influence to convince the masses to go along with their views. The Vanderlyn gang thinks their actions are justified because Dutch has convinced them through his influence. Likewise, the Pinkertons are convinced that they are right for hunting down the gang because the rule of law, as decided upon by the men in power, tells them it is so. Every society, culture, and civilization throughout history has functioned this way, and the groups we see in the world of Red Dead Redemption are no different. The laws and customs of one area may differ greatly from those of another. A frontier town like Strawberry, for instance, might be welcoming and inviting to all, while a town like Rhodes could be dangerous for people from various walks of life and racial backgrounds. A town like Saint Denis, with its massive population, might even be a combination of both welcoming and dangerous, though a city that big typically winds up having more than racism and petty crime to deal with. Arthur, Dutch, Hosea, and Bill find this out firsthand as they attend a party at the mayor of Saint Denis' house. They are there as a special guest of Angelo Bronte, as he continues to pander to Dutch's ego in an attempt to win over the gang leader and gain his cooperation. As Arthur and Dutch visit with Bronte before going down to the party, they are treated to an introduction to the worst the town has to offer. Bronte points out the politically corrupt mayor, who will do anything for $1, the leader of a sugar plantation named Alberto Fusar, who we'll become better acquainted with later, and a former Confederate general, who apparently is worth mentioning because his wife is so much younger than him. Introductions aside, Bronte also makes an offer to Dutch when he hears the gang is in town looking for money. It turns out the trolley station is apparently flush with cash, and Bronte gives Dutch his blessing to rob the place. Now, anyone with half a brain would likely recognize this offer as a setup, but we'll get there shortly. The party itself is rather extravagant, especially as we find out later that the city is broke and is barely hanging on due to the mayor's shady business dealings. First off, I would be remiss if I didn't dive deeper here into the class structure and the ethicality of holding a party paid for by city funds when there are people starving in the streets of Saint Denis. Historically, money has been something hoarded by those who can get their hands on it and chased by those who can barely make enough. It's a balancing act by those in power to give just enough to the people to keep them placated, while working to grow and consolidate power and wealth at the top. On the one hand, society and government have a duty to lift up as many people as possible, as society only exists so long as we are able to cooperate and agree to the rules. On the other, there's a sense of unfairness that comes from sharing the spoils of the group with those who didn't earn them. And that discrepancy between giving people a hand up and providing handouts causes a lot of strife when debating class systems and wealth distribution. You could argue that the people in the high society of Saint Denis earned their wealth, and that they should be able to spend it however they want. If they want to throw a party, even a party paid for by the city, they should be able to do that. After all, their money is likely what is funding the city in the first place, so what's the harm? On the flip side, however, many of those wealthy individuals may not have earned their wealth at all, having it handed down to them, and even those who did earn it likely did so by taking advantage of others and stepping on the backs of the working class. The big question we have to ask here is whether or not those with means have any obligation to help those who are struggling in society, and digging deeper into it, if they do have some moral obligation, where does it begin and end? If I have enough money to buy a decent house and put food on the table and clothes on my back, should I strive to put every extra dollar into helping those who aren't able to acquire those things? Or is there some level of excess where I have an obligation to give back that I didn't have at lower levels? Traditionally, these questions are answered partially through the agreement of using an organized government body to collect taxes that are then used to fund certain aspects of society. In theory, this works well as it allows individuals to keep a certain amount while forcing them to give at least some of it back to the system that helped them succeed in the first place. But, as we see in Saint Denis, governments can easily become corrupt, tailoring policy and spending to one group of people over another depending on the leanings of the people in charge. An ideal system would be set up so that everyone had an equal chance of success, and so that no one would need to go without. We would look after those who were unable to provide for themselves and make sure that everyone had what they needed, regardless of their class affiliation. But as corruption seeps into the systems we put in place and greed takes hold, people lose faith in the process and in the system as a whole. We see people starving in the streets as the powerful claim that those people deserve their lot due to poor work ethic, the wrong nationality, skin color, or some other trait beyond their control, and apathy sets in as we feel helpless to do anything. Then, like the Vanderlyn gang, we give up and decide to focus on our own well-being while taking an every man for himself attitude. From the history of the gang, we know that they started out trying to help others where possible, taking the money they stole from the rich to make the lives of the poor better. But over time, Dutch started to realize that the little bit they were able to give back was a drop in the bucket, and he started focusing more on the gang and getting them as much wealth as possible. But not everyone is in need of financial help. As we leave the party at the mayor's house and head out into the streets of the city to meet Rains Fall and his son Eagle Flies. This isn't the first time we've seen them, as they were on the Overlook as we crossed the river moving from Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook, and Bronte pointed them out at the mayor's party as they seemed to be seeking an audience with him. But it is the first time that we can interact with them. They are accompanied by Evelyn Miller, who has taken up the fight to help them to keep the land that they call home. The government has been forcefully moving them from place to place, and while Rains Fall, the chief of their tribe, the Wapiti, is trying his best to keep peace and work things out without bloodshed, his son is ready to fight. Obviously, the storyline is based on the real-life events during the first century plus of the United States, where the government would take land from Native Americans that called it home, forcefully moving the inhabitants from one place to another. But there's something else to look at here, as this situation mirrors that of the Vanderlyn gang in many ways. The Vanderlyns might not have ancestral claims to any land, but they are being forced to change and adapt to the world in a very similar way. The Wapiti are powerless to stop the encroachment and harassment of the federal government, with the army constantly pushing them and breaking treaties. Likewise, the Vanderlyn gang is powerless to stop the advancement of society that is pushing their way of life further and further out of reach. Both groups have a choice to either accept the new way of doing things or fight the change. Arthur and Rains Fall have the burden of being the one in their group to lobby for accepting the inevitable, while Dutch and Eagle Flies both hold on to the past. Here we have our first chance to help the Wapiti by stealing some of the documents from the Cornwall Kerosene and Tar Company, with Eagle Flies begrudgingly meeting us before saving Arthur by causing an explosion. All we can do for now is hope that the documents we stole might be of some use. But the Wapiti will play a bigger role in the fate of the gang in Chapter 6. In the short term, we turn our attention back to making money, with the successful robbery of the riverboat adding to the gang's coffers, before all hell breaks loose as Dutch tries to take Bronte up on his offer to rob the trolley station. The robbery starts off okay, but as Arthur searches the safe, they find out Bronte wasn't exactly truthful when he said there was a lot of cash there to be taken. But they've barely got time to dwell on the obvious deceit as an army of police come marching in, forcing Arthur, Dutch, and Lenny to take drastic actions. Hijacking a trolley car, they speed through the streets of Saint Denis, with the barrage of bullets turning the city into a war zone. It turns out Bronte didn't just lie to them, he set them up, and by the time they escape with $15 each, oh, and a quarter, don't forget the quarter, Dutch has made up his mind that Angelo Bronte needs to be dealt with. Now, Hosea disagrees with Dutch's plan to get revenge on Bronte, saying it's stupid and insisting that there has to be a better way. Dutch says it isn't about revenge, that they need to take out Bronte to have any hope of robbing the bank in town and getting away clean. But do they even need to rob the bank? As we discussed in the last video, they likely have more than enough money saved up to escape back west. And if they just keep their heads down, maybe going back west and waiting a short while before collecting the money in Blackwater, they could be free. And we know that, while Dutch will insist it isn't about revenge, he has a way of holding grudges. As Dutch and Arthur ride off to meet a friend of Dutch's about a boat in Le Gras, they discuss the gang situation, and Arthur points out something that I think is worth mentioning because it really highlights their situation and makes us look at how they got into this mess. He mentions that they have a lot of pots on the boil, a reference to how many groups they're running from or fighting, and how many big jobs they're trying to plan at once. The obvious things to think about are the bank job in Saint Denis, running alongside so many other recent heists, and the new plan to get rid of Bronte. But there is also the Pinkertons, who seem to be just a step behind them at all times, the O'Driscolls, who attacked them at Shady Belle after killing Kieran, the Greys and the Braithwaites, who are mostly dismantled but likely would still be seeking some revenge, Bronte and his horde of officials and police in Saint Denis, Leviticus Cornwall, who has made a personal appearance once already in search of Dutch, the Lemoyne Raiders, who are angry at them for encroaching on their turf, and various lawmen and bounty hunters chasing them for the huge bounty on Dutch's head. That list may not even be exhaustive, but it highlights the fact that they really don't need to make any more enemies or stir up more trouble for themselves. Dutch thinks that getting rid of Bronte will make their lives easier, but even with as much power as he has only one man, and they're facing armies. And this is where we see Dutch's manipulative nature pop up again, as he insinuates that questioning him is akin to rebellion, and that Arthur even daring to think that there is any problem with his plans means he wants the gang to break up or go their separate ways. Arthur, like Hosea, just wants to really think through things and do what's best for the gang as a whole, while Dutch seems hellbent on causing utter chaos. And the situation they find themselves in as Saint Denis becomes more hostile is eerily similar to the situation in Blackwater. That town saw Hosea and Arthur trying to scope out and plan some reasonable jobs, even as Dutch seemed to throw caution to the wind and go for a big score with no thought to the fallout. In the same way, Arthur and Hosea are trying to be the voice of reason now as Dutch runs headlong into a train. After a fun night in the swamp, where Arthur came face to face with a gator that probably could have swallowed the boat they were in whole if it chose, Dutch, Bill, Lenny, John, and Arthur laid siege to Angela Bronte's mansion, killing a lot of guards and police in the process. Bronte was clearly expecting some kind of retaliation from Dutch, but I don't think he expected that assault to be so successful, as John and Arthur burst into his room to find him begging for his life. John knocks him out, and after another brief fight, they all wind up back on the boat in the swamp, with Bronte as their prisoner. But Dutch isn't content with having a prisoner. He wants to get back at the so-called strongman by feeding him to the gators. And this is where we can highlight one more difference between Dutch and Bronte. Bronte thinks everything revolves around money, and that everyone can be bought, while Dutch knows that there are some things that money can't buy, like loyalty. Bronte offers $1,000 to the first man to kill Dutch and set him free, assuming one of the men will take the offer. I just snickered as he cowered because I had a few $1,000s on me at the time, so his measly grand didn't really mean anything to me. But none of the other guys budged either, because they're all loyal to Dutch for one reason or another, and couldn't be bought so easily. The fear in Bronte's eyes was very real, as he realized he wasn't going to be getting out of the boat as easily as he'd hoped. But part of him still assumed he would at least be leaving it alive. At least until Dutch grabbed him and shoved his face into the swamp like he was part of some freshman hazing ritual. And there is some debate to be had about whether Dutch killing Bronte could be considered moral. From a certain perspective, the city of Saint Denis and the world at large could be considered better off without men like him. He really was nothing more than a bully who lied, cheated, and murdered his way to the top, and he arguably caused more harm than good. On the other hand, there will always be people like him, and the power vacuum he leaves in Saint Denis will just be filled by some other jackass eventually. But there's also the intent to consider, as Dutch was either killing him for revenge or in an attempt to make robbing the bank in town easier. Either way, neither of those pursuits is noble or beneficial to the community as a whole. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about whether Dutch was justified and whether Bronte being taken out was an overall good for Saint Denis. That incident winds up being yet another blip on the radar for the Vanderlyn gang, as the very next action the gang takes is to move on the bank. As solid as the plan they have seems, it all falls apart when Agent Milton shows up with an army of Pinkertons, and a willingness to kill any and all of Dutch's people. Hosea is the first to be shot, with Lenny being taken out on the escape across the rooftops of the city. John is captured, with Dutch saying that there was nothing he could have done to save him, and a small group consisting of Micah, Dutch, Arthur, Bill, Javier, and Charles wind up hiding out in an empty building until nightfall, as the Pinkertons lock the city down and hunt for them. Under the cover of darkness, the men wind up escaping, with Charles giving them a window by running as a distraction, and they take the only way out that they can see: a boat. But they aren't in the clear, as a storm is brewing on the horizon, and the next chapter will bring them to their knees as they lose more than they ever thought possible, even as Dutch gets his wish of life on an island. Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're hopping on a boat after things went sideways in Saint Denis and heading for paradise on the plantation island of Guarma. But there's more than just an island vacation in this chapter. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Things couldn't have gone much worse for the Vanderlyn gang in Saint Denis. They tried, and failed, to wrestle control of the city from Angelo Bronte, before the Pinkerton Detective Agency finally caught up with them in a bank robbery mission that went completely off the rails. Escaping onto a boat, Dutch, Arthur, Micah, Javier, and Bill found themselves paying off the captain and stowing away, bound for northern Cuba. Like every other plan Dutch comes up with when they get into varying degrees of trouble, this one is bound to fail in some way. The idea that they would be able to hold up a while in Cuba before heading back and gathering the remainder of the gang is laughable at best. But they won't have the chance to even attempt that plan as a storm overpowers the ship, sending it to the bottom of the ocean as the Vanderlyn gang boys struggle to find safety. Arthur is separated from the rest in the chaos, and as he comes out onto the deck of the ship, he can see his mentor and allies floating away on a lifeboat they no doubt commandeered from other sailors who'd been trying to escape. While it could be argued that Dutch was just doing what he thought was best, this action shows a willingness in him to leave behind a man he calls his son. We'll find out later, though, that this isn't the first time he's done something like this, as a similar situation took place in the bank in Saint Denis. But for the moment, we'll remain with Arthur, since he doesn't seem to have anyone else who cares enough to stick by his side. Diving into the cold ocean water, Arthur struggles to stay afloat. Somehow, he manages to save himself, and with the light of the morning sun, he washes ashore on what appears to be some kind of island. He's dehydrated, tired, sunburnt, and desperate for any sign of life as he stumbles through the sand. The fact that he survived the shipwreck is a miracle, but he'll need another blessing if he wants to last much longer. Thankfully, Arthur gained enough karma from his missions with Brother Dorkins to get him that second helping hand as he runs into Dutch and the gang. They're sitting around a campfire and actually seem happy to see him, though part of me wonders if at least one of them was a little more upset than happy. I don't often venture into unfounded theories in these videos, but I've got a hypothesis I've built based on Micah and his desire to get rid of Arthur. It goes back to at least when Arthur was kidnapped by the O'Driscolls, an event I intentionally left out of the Clemens Point video, and follows through to the escape from the ship and beyond. See, while Pearson was the one to bring the news of the O'Driscolls wanting a meeting for peace, I think Micah was on the root of that idea. I don't have much to back it up, but I think that he either encouraged the meeting through talking to Pearson, or planned it all out with the O'Driscoll gang. His intent would have been to have them kidnap and maybe even kill Arthur, giving him an easier time of manipulating Dutch, as Arthur and Hosea had been two of his biggest hurdles. Arthur wasn't supposed to free himself, let alone make it back to camp. So Micah had to keep trying and waiting for other opportunities. I also think he encouraged Dutch to leave Arthur behind on the boat, reasoning that they had to leave or else they would all be dead. And Dutch went along because, as we all saw with Bronte, Dutch is really easy to manipulate if you just whisper the right words. That is mostly speculation, just based on observations as I've been breaking down the story, but I wanted to put it out there because this chapter is where we really see things start crashing down for the gang as a whole. Dutch starts a descent that he'll never fully recover from, and we start to see sides forming in a mini civil war. One of those sides is on the island with Arthur, forging itself through the blood and sweat of a rebellion. Micah, Bill, and Javier are all part of the group that will eventually bring the gang to its knees, but those seeds have only just started to germinate. Before we can get there, we have a slight detour to make, as the gang is captured by a group of soldiers loyal to a man that we met at the mayor's party in Saint Denis, Alberto Fusar. He essentially runs the island of Guarma through the sugar plantations he owns, and his men don't take kindly to outsiders. But Fusar's men aren't the only militia on the island, as a group of rebels ambushes the chain gang Arthur and the others are in, and after a brief fight there is some relative peace, allowing Dutch and Micah to plan an escape from paradise. Part of that plan involves freeing Javier, who wasn't able to break free with the others in the ambush, and Arthur soon finds himself following Dutch and a guide through a cave system that leads them behind enemy lines. There are a couple of things worth noting in this mission. One is how Dutch seems to be convinced that there has been a spy in the gang over the past few months. He doesn't think it is mere coincidence that the gang has had such a run of what could be considered bad luck, and he even has a suspect. He noticed that while Hosea and Abigail had been together to cause the distraction during the bank job in Saint Denis, only Hosea was captured and killed by the Pinkertons. He also finds it suspicious that John was captured alive when Hosea and Lenny were both killed on sight. This seems to point to either Abigail or John, or both, being in league with the Pinkertons. But is that really even a possibility? Both John and Abigail have been with the gang for a long time, and both have been loyal so far as we know. While Abigail does seem intent on seeing John safe, even if it means leaving the gang, she just doesn't seem like the kind of person to sell out the gang any more than John does. Not only that, as we see later on, she's worried sick that John is going to be hung in prison. It's not likely that she would be as worried about that if she had been an informant, as her actions would have been enough to secure John's safety and/or freedom. Besides that, it isn't like they even need a spy with how sloppy they often are. Dutch seems dead set on getting every penny he can, even when conditions for robbing are horrible. The bank in Saint Denis is a great example. With the recent heat around them kidnapping and killing Bronte, and the fact that the Pinkertons walked into their camp at Clemens Point, it was only a matter of time before things went south. Dutch and the gang were playing with fire, and they wound up being burnt. They didn't need someone with a lighter because the inferno had been building for a long time. The other thing worth pointing out on this spelunking adventure is how easily Dutch strangles their guide as they come to the end of the cave. She is demanding more money for leading them through, and she pulls a knife on Dutch. But he didn't really have anything to fear from her, and he almost seemed to enjoy killing her. He says she was going to rat them out, but he isn't able to provide any proof of that outside of a feeling, though he does initially tell Arthur that she was saying something suspicious in Spanish, and that he could understand some of what she was saying. That is contradicted a couple of minutes later when he says that he could see it in her eyes. And we have to wonder how far gone Dutch is at this point. Between the bad decision-making of the past several months and now the seeming ease in which he kills an old woman in basically cold blood. He doesn't seem to be the same Dutch that Arthur once idolized. Arthur and Dutch manage to rescue Javier, and the group fights their way through a sugarcane field before we wander into the final couple of missions Guarma has to offer. The group has been able to find a boat and a captain willing to help them get home, but before they can leave, they have to take care of a battleship that is blockading the harbor, destroy some guns that could take out the boat, and free the captain from the grip of Fusar himself. On the ride back to America, we get a glimpse of Micah's end goal, as he suggests going back to Blackwater to get the money that they left there. Dutch actually shouts him down for once, and it almost seems like he has a level head on his shoulders for a moment. He suggests splitting up and laying low until they can find the rest of the gang, and that might be the most sensible plan that Dutch has put forward this entire game. A group of men, especially wanted outlaws, would stick out like a sore thumb, but as individuals they can blend in a little better and find the group a little easier. Arthur is sent to check Shady Belle, to see if everyone got out and if they left a note, and the ride to the old camp is backed by one of the most powerful musical tracks the game has to offer, Unshaken by D'Angelo. This ride back to Shady Belle is meant to give Arthur a chance to reflect on the events that led to this moment, with the lyrics of the song hammering this idea home. May I stand unshaken, amidst the crash of the world. Did I hear the thunder? Did I hear you pray? I can't quite remember just what guided me this way. Everything up to this point has been for the gang, for the family. But that family is now scattered to the wind, and Arthur doesn't know if he'll even see any of them again. Even if they do manage to reconnect, what happened on Guarma and everything that led up to that trip will have to be addressed. And the fissures we talked about all the way back in Chapter 2 have become chasms that are quickly swallowing members of the gang whole. Kieran, Sean, Hosea, and Lenny have all been taken by the insatiable hunger of Dutch as he scorches the earth in search of money. Karen, Tilly, Miss Grimshaw, Sadie, Pearson, Uncle, Charles, Reverend Swanson, Strauss, Abigail, and Jack are all missing, and John is either dead or in jail. The gang is, for all intents and purposes, dead. But the stragglers are still around, and Sadie Adler has taken the lead in the absence of Dutch and the rest. She left a note for Arthur on a table in Shady Belle, and he's able to locate them without too much trouble in the abandoned swamp town of Lakay. Dutch, Bill, Micah, and Javier show up quickly too, but there isn't a lot of time to celebrate as the Pinkertons happen to find them around the same time as Bill. This time, though, they didn't come to bargain or ask for Dutch to surrender. They came to wipe the gang out. And in the process of trying to kill off the gang, Agent Milton shows just how vile he is when he tells them that he enjoyed killing Mac Callender and Hosea. And we can talk here about the morality of what Milton is doing, and how he falls into the legal but unethical side of things. As we discussed in a previous episode, laws aren't necessarily based on moral groundwork, being written by people who are often more concerned with profiting than with doing the right thing. The Vanderlyn gang is both illegal and unethical because they rob and murder, but the Pinkertons are legal and unethical because they murder with the proper permission. If the right people give you the go-ahead, you won't have to face the gallows. But there is also some room here to point out that Milton and Ross did try to straddle that legal-ethical line as they chased the gang. They confronted Arthur without taking him in or causing him harm, and even offered to let the gang go free in Clemens Point if Dutch would just turn himself in. What Milton did to Mac, if he actually killed him, crossed that line, but we didn't see that action and only have his word to go on. Shooting Hosea is the first time we see him actually commit an act that would put him in the unethical territory, and things don't get better from there. But he also pulls the mask back when he admits that he enjoyed those killings. He and Micah might have a lot in common there, though Milton has taken the legal way to get in the pleasure that he seeks. As the smoke clears and the dust settles, most of the Pinkertons are either dead or fleeing, and Dutch seems to be on the verge of a mental breakdown. As the wheels in his head struggle to turn and figure out what's next, Abigail asks him about saving John, and we see just how easy it's becoming for him to abandon those he once called friend. He claims they'll be saving John at some point, but with no clear timeline and how worried Abigail is about him being hanged, someone else is going to have to step up. And that someone is the person who's been taking the leadership role more and more, Sadie Adler. She asks Arthur to meet her at a familiar spot, Doyle's Tavern, which you'll recognize from the video I made about Charles Châtenay. Before he can make it there, however, he finds out the consequences of his outlaw ways. Riding through the streets of Saint Denis, Arthur has a coughing fit that causes him to get down from his horse and collapse on the ground. A passerby helps him off the road and leads him to the doctor's office, where he is given some very bad news. Arthur has tuberculosis. His time in this world, as it turns out, is limited, and there might not be much time left. Still reeling from the diagnosis, Arthur joins Sadie and winds up taking a hot air balloon ride over the Sisika prison island. Sadie isn't able to join him because, as everyone knows,
Oh, women can't fly, sir. Are you insane?
They can't.
Oh, no, sir. It does terrible damage to them, to their vapors. I thought everyone knew about that. Why, a delicate flower like Mrs. Adler? Heavens above! Or below.
the whole thing is a ruse so Arthur can confirm John is still on the island after being arrested, but it also serves another purpose, given its proximity to Arthur getting the news about his health. While flying nowadays is considered commonplace, flying in 1899 was a rare treat that very few people had the privilege of partaking in. Getting up in the sky and being able to see things from a new perspective can really help you understand the bigger picture, much in the same way that knowing you're going to die can help you see things in a new way. And this mission may just be one of my favorites in the game for that reason. It gives us a top-down view of Saint Denis, the massive, imposing city that caused us so much pain and started what would eventually lead to the end of the gang. From this angle, the city doesn't look as big or as bad as it seems when we're strolling through the streets. But no matter how beautiful the view is, the ride can't last forever. And after being shot at by the prison guards, Arthur manages to steer the balloon back toward the mainland to discover Sadie being chased by a group of O'Driscolls. She's taken to hunting them lately, though this time she needs a little help. From above, we can see that she is very outnumbered as she races down the coast. Thankfully, the wind blows just right to allow Arthur to keep up with her, though the event isn't without incident as the balloonist, Arturo Bullard, is shot in the fight and Arthur is left to steer the balloon himself. This isn't too big a hurdle, and he's able to rescue Sadie before crashing the airship and fighting off the remaining O'Driscolls. Parting ways with Sadie, Arthur heads back to the camp to find Dutch sitting on the porch of one of the buildings while playing an imaginary game of chess in his head. It's clear he's starting to disconnect more and more from reality, and he is once again focused on revenge. He wants to get back at the Pinkertons and Cornwall, and he sends Arthur and Charles to scout a new camp in Roanoke Ridge as he and Micah go to do some reconnaissance on something. And Roanoke Ridge will be where the final chapter for the gang takes place. It's a dangerous area run by a group known as the Murphy Brood, and Charles and Arthur have to clear out a cave full of them before bringing the rest of the gang to settle in. While clearing the cave, the pair discover a girl trapped in a cage, and Arthur delivers her back to her home in Annesburg before three things happen that will shape the discussion for the next video. The first involves the decision Arthur and the player is presented with to either accept or reject a reward for bringing the girl home. This is the second time we've been given an option like this, the first being shown when we met Brother Dorkins in Saint Denis. In that instance, it made sense to reject the reward because it was meant to help the poor in the city. But this time, it's coming from someone's pocket instead of a collection plate. While it may be tempting to accept the money, it doesn't really make a lot of sense from Arthur's perspective, as it won't really do him a lot of good. For one thing, it's likely that he has quite a bit of money at this point anyway. And for another, he's not going to be able to do much with it in the time that he has left. He might not know for sure how many days or weeks he'll get, but he does know his time is limited and he can feel the TB getting worse. Another thing that happens right after Arthur parts ways with the girl and her mother is that he spots a familiar face. Mrs. Downs has made her way to Annesburg and is apparently working as a prostitute to make ends meet. This is the second time Arthur runs into her following the death of her husband, and it's clear that she isn't in a good place. She disappears into a house before Arthur can do much more than recognize her, but this won't be the last time the pair will meet. Finally, when Arthur gets back to the new camp, the gang is interrupted during their setup by a drunk Molly O'Shea, who's been retrieved from Saint Denis by Uncle and who has a secret to tell. She claims that she told the Pinkertons about the Saint Denis bank job in the hopes that they'd kill Dutch. But did she really rat them out? That's a question that we'll have to answer next week. Gorma is one of the most hated chapters by a lot of people because it slows things down and seems to interrupt the flow of the story. But it was also the most important chapter for setting up the gang's downfall. It also forces us and Arthur to reevaluate things, making us think about the events that brought us to Beaver Hollow, the final camp, and driving us to consider what Arthur's legacy will be. And that's going to be a big focus of Chapter 6. Can Arthur be redeemed for all he's done? What does it take to make up for a lifetime of bad choices? And is it even possible to rewrite the ledger? Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh, Bearheart Hawk, and today we're riding into the final camp for the Vanderlinde gang in Red Dead Redemption 2's concluding chapter, Beaver Hollow. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. The end of Chapter 5 saw Molly O'Shea, Dutch's romantic interest throughout the game, being dragged back into camp by Uncle. She was yelling at Dutch and very clearly drunk, and she wound up telling him and the group that she'd ratted them out for the bank job in Saint Denis. Now, there's a couple of things here that we need to look at with Molly and how her relationship with Dutch has been before jumping to conclusions. Throughout the game, we've seen her and Dutch arguing in various camps, with the couple growing more and more distant with each move. She seems to be trying to reach out and connect with him, even as he seems to care less and less about her. And likely, that desire to get Dutch's attention is what brought her to the point of confessing her transgression. But did she really do it? Near the end of the chapter, we find out from Agent Milton that while they had talked to Molly a few times, she'd never given up any information about the gang. This would imply that she was lying, but why would she do that? She knew the penalty for betraying the gang, and the only thing that makes sense is that she really loved Dutch and was so desperate for his attention that she'd risk being killed or exiled to get anything she could out of him. This is similar in some ways to a child who is trying to get their parents' attention by causing trouble. The child does it because the only time the parent seems to respond is when there is something wrong. And Molly, no doubt, knows that Dutch will turn his attention fully to her if he thinks that she betrayed him. She's most likely hoping that he'll give her time to explain and things will end up okay, but she's sorely mistaken as Miss Grimshaw gets involved. She shoots Molly without hesitation, shocking several members of the gang and opening this chapter with the heaviest feeling the gang has had so far. They've lost members, but this particular loss feels different. It happened right in front of everyone, as emotions were running high, and the whole situation sets the tone for the final days. But this chapter isn't really about the gang. It's about Arthur and asking the question, can someone who's led a life as bad as Arthur Morgan be redeemed for his actions? He's robbed innocent people, killed people who probably didn't deserve it, and he's struggled to do even a little bit of good in a world filled with so much bad. Even if he has high honor in the game, the actions he's taken aren't always honorable, and many can't be made up for. For instance, his interaction with Thomas Downs and the Downs family in general. Early on, we see Arthur trying to recover a debt from Thomas, the interaction that would ultimately lead to Arthur getting tuberculosis. While he likely couldn't have done anything to save or prolong Thomas's life, he could have chosen a different path and perhaps made things a little easier on his widow and son. And speaking of Mrs. Downs, Arthur has run into her a couple of times over the course of the game, starting with an encounter in Saint Denis, and most recently after returning the girl that he found in the cave to her home in Annesburg. She isn't doing well, and Arthur runs into her once more as she's trying to solicit work from a couple of miners in the street. She doesn't really want to talk to him, but she does eventually open up a bit as Arthur tries to apologize for everything that's happened. She tells him that he should use his abilities to bring some good into the world instead of causing harm, and tells him that her son is working in the mines now to try and make ends meet. That doesn't sit well with Arthur, especially when he hears that the foreman isn't treating the boy very well, and Arthur makes his way over to try and remedy the situation. He finds the boy being harassed by a group of men at the entrance to one of the mines, and as Arthur fights off the bullies, we can revisit an earlier idea about the morality of society versus that of outlaws. The last time we looked at it was in the city of Saint Denis in regards to how people like Angelo Bronte weren't really any better than the Vanderlyn gang, but were able to get away with things because they have the money and influence to do so. But these miners show us that the rich and powerful aren't the only problem when it comes to a more civilized way of living. They've grouped up against what is essentially a kid and are treating him like trash. This is something that many of us have likely encountered in the real world. Bullies like this exist in every walk of life. They're often nothing more than a scared and pathetic individual that have pushed their own trauma deep down into the back of their mind and lash out at others who seem like easy targets to make themselves feel better and to give themselves some semblance of control over their lives. These miners, for instance, are probably miserable on a day-to-day basis. They don't make enough money to get out of their situation, and they don't feel like they have any escape from the mines. They've likely seen friends die, either in some kind of accident or because of the poor air quality that they have to breathe in, and they know that they've only got so much time before one of those things takes them as well. Like Arthur, their days are numbered, and they choose to lash out rather than try to find a positive outlet for their frustrations. Torturing some kid because his mom is a prostitute, driven to that because of a bad situation, and because he's easy to push around, is one of the worst things they could do, and it puts them in line with a lot of the things that the Vanderlyn gang has done on a moral level. But Arthur doesn't just rescue the kid from the miners. He offers him money and tells him to get himself and his mom out of the city and go somewhere nicer. That might work, except that Mrs. Downs doesn't want to accept the money from the man that she blames for her husband's death, and Arthur winds up having to rescue her as well a little later as she's gone off with a potential client that appears to have some pretty bad intentions. That interaction, combined with a little bit of a push from Arthur, finally convinces her to leave, and the last time that we see her and her son in the main story, they are heading into their house to pack. And this is the first time that we can really start to focus on the redemption part of Red Dead Redemption, and what that means. Giving Mrs. Downs and her son some money after rescuing them from some bad situations is a positive thing overall, as it contributes to increasing their well-being. But that action is overshadowed by Arthur's role in their predicament to begin with. But how much blame does he have for where they ultimately wound up? Mrs. Downs blames Arthur, or at least appears to on the surface, but I think it goes a lot deeper. On the one hand, Strauss is partly to blame for offering high-risk loans in the first place. When you prey on people who are desperate, knowing the likelihood of them being able to pay back the loans is very low, you open yourself up to the risk that you don't need to take on. By offering Mr. Downs the loan in the first place, Strauss was almost guaranteeing that he would need to send Arthur to collect later on. But there is also a layer of blame, potentially, for Mr. Downs for taking the loan in the first place from someone he had to have known was a loan shark who would send an enforcer to collect. Those collections are seldom peaceful events, so the risk of taking the loan in the first place was likely to turn out bad for him, or for his family. Now, we don't know his entire financial situation for sure, and we don't know much about his actions prior to taking the loan. We know that he would hang out in Valentine and collect money for the poor from our first glance at him in Chapter 2, but we don't know if he was usually responsible and just wound up falling on hard times through no fault of his own, if he made some bad judgment calls, or if he intentionally took the loans and handouts where he could get them, thinking that he would be able to get away with it. We do know that he took the loan from Strauss knowing full well that he was dying, and that, while he may have loved his wife and son, he didn't seem to mind that they would have to pay for his sins once he was gone. And that is the real reason Mrs. Downs is so upset with Arthur. She knows her husband ultimately made some bad financial decisions, but he isn't here to blame, and she doesn't want to admit that he would have left them in that situation. She knows that he loved her, or at least she wants to know it, but she needs somewhere to place her anger. The most logical place to put it is the man who came to collect the debt in the first place. The man who she sees as responsible for her husband going to an early grave because he couldn't or wouldn't just forgive the debt and give them a break. If she tells herself that he was pushed harder than he should have been, it means that she can keep a good memory of him. At the end of the day, Arthur didn't take or even give out the loan. He simply showed up to collect on a debt that was owed. He didn't really need to get as physical as he did, but he didn't know Mr. Downs' health was as bad as it was, and, right or wrong, roughing up debtors was a common practice in the world of loan sharking, because there was really no other way to make sure people prioritized paying the money back. So ultimately, there wasn't really a lot that Arthur needed to be redeemed for in this situation. Sure, he could have just forgiven the debt, but that wouldn't have saved Mr. Downs' life, and from the look of things when he returns to collect after the man's death, the family wasn't in a very good financial situation to begin with. Forgiving that little bit of debt wouldn't have helped them to keep their house, and at most, it would have given them a few more weeks before they ran out of money completely. After finishing up with Mrs. Downs and her son, Arthur joins Sadie to save John from prison, disappointing Dutch in the process. Despite his claims that he was planning to send for John at the right time, Dutch never planned to save the man he once called son. At this point, the gang is all but disbanded, acting more like a group of random people who just happened to be living in the same spot than a family that would die for each other. It's a reality check moment where Arthur really starts to focus on what comes next as he realizes his mentor has jumped the shark. Micah has weaseled his way into Dutch's mind and is firmly in control now. And that is made ever more clear as Arthur joins Dutch and Micah back in Annesburg to put one more nail in their coffin. Leviticus Cornwall has been hunting them ever since the train robbery in Chapter 1. And Micah has convinced Dutch that the only way to fix their situation is to take out the robber baron. He's coming to Annesburg to look into buying the mine, but that operation winds up being derailed as Dutch steps out from behind some nearby crates to try and extort him. Anyone with half a brain would probably realize that a man like Cornwall isn't going to just give in to the demands of someone like Dutch Vanderland. But while Dutch may have thought that that was a possibility, Micah never did. He wanted to see chaos, and he would get it, as Dutch opened up fire and gunned down the man. This is more or less a repeat of the situation with Bronte from Chapter 4, though on a much bigger scale, as Cornwall was much richer and more powerful than Bronte. Bronte controlled a city. Cornwall controlled half the country. And like the situation with Bronte, taking out Cornwall does nothing other than open a power vacuum that will eventually be filled by someone else. The problem isn't the people running the institution, it's the rules that those people implement. Looking at Cornwall, he pays to have laws changed and eliminated. Those laws will still be what they were after his death, and if he didn't do it, someone else would. A lot of that comes from a complacency in society, a willingness to point to a villain rather than address the actual causes of things like wealth inequality and an unfair system. It's easier to point to someone like Cornwall or a specific group of people in society and blame them for all of the problems that exist than it is to actually change the system into something that works for everyone. If there's one lesson that we can take away here, it's that the best thing we can do for society as a whole is to be informed and actively participate in making the world better overall. We spend way too much time looking for villains and not nearly enough time working towards solutions. And until we start making an effort, things will never improve. The situation with Cornwall is only one piece of the puzzle falling into place, though, as Arthur and Dutch both take up roles in the plight of the Wapiti tribe. They are fighting an uphill battle against the government to have some land to call home. And Dutch and Arthur each have a role to play. Dutch sees the tribe as expendable, a pawn in their quest to escape the law. He sits firmly with the chief's son, Eagle Flies, a young man who sees open war as the only option. He thinks his father is weak, and he would rather die free than live under the oppression that they've been forced to suffer for too long. Arthur genuinely wants to help, and he does his best to assist Rain's Fall with peace talks after recovering some sacred items the army stole from them. The chief sees his son as hot-headed, but he also cares deeply about him and just wants what's best for the tribe. And with the exception of Dutch using them, there isn't really a right or wrong answer on the part of the Wapiti. They just want to be free, to live their lives in peace, and to be able to honor their own customs and traditions. Both Rain's Fall and Eagle Flies have valid views, and while it could be argued that Eagle Flies' way of doing things could result in more bloodshed, Rain's Fall's way hasn't been much more productive. The heart of the issue, just like with Cornwall and Bronte, is a corrupt system that leans into profit and helping the rich and powerful over making things better for those who need the help. The army is used by the government to carry out the atrocities, othering the Wapiti to make the soldiers go along with the plan. This problem is only made worse through the efforts of the man in charge of the local brigade, Colonel Favors, who is desperate to relive his glory days and make up for past mistakes. But all of that aside for a moment, the reason the government wants the Wapiti land in the first place comes down to drilling for oil. But the oil isn't even really the focus. In reality, the whole thing stems from a desire for constant financial growth, with companies like Cornwall Kerosene and Tar participating in or justifying horrific acts like uprooting people from their homes in the name of profit. They don't do it because they need something like a life-saving medicine that is going to save the world. They do it because they need the numbers in their accounts to keep going up. We've talked about utilitarianism in prior videos. Loosely, the idea that the right thing to do, morally, would be the thing that brings the most benefit to the largest number of people. That applies here, as we could easily argue that what the government is doing is immoral because they are actively causing more harm than they are preventing by continuing to push the Wapiti further and further from their home. If your actions are causing people to suffer and die, and the results of those actions aren't beneficial to anyone outside of shareholders, you should probably reevaluate the way that you do things, because a system like that isn't sustainable. At some point, the system will fall apart and you won't be immune from the fallout just because you have a fancy boat or an armed security detail. But things don't end well for the Wapiti, as Dutch and Arthur's competing approaches collide and Eagle Flies winds up being killed in an assault on the Cornwall Kerosene and Tar Building. It's a sad situation because it was entirely preventable. The land that the tribe was on wasn't really needed by the government or any company, and they really shouldn't have been moved in the first place. The escalation of hostilities when Dutch got involved was definitely not helpful, and if everyone would have just kept a cool head and been honest and truthful in the negotiations regarding the land, things could have turned out much better. Backing up for just a second, the final chapter also provides Arthur an opportunity to right some wrongs and at least try to be a better person overall. Helping Rains fall by recovering the sacred items and stealing medicine back from the army is one part of this redemption, but there is more as we have the chance to recover a couple of debts set out by Leopold Strauss. These final recoveries don't have to be recoveries, though, as Arthur has the chance to learn from his past mistakes and actually help the debtors that he's charged with tracking down. The first is a man who deserted the army, opting to run off with his Native American wife and child rather than do more harm in the world. The second is a man who died in the mine in Annesburg, leaving behind a wife and son very similar to the situation with the Downs. And that right there is the truth to the redemption arc that is easily overlooked. It isn't really about Arthur being redeemed, it's about him learning from his mistakes and becoming a force for good in the world. See, the idea of an honor meter, where your actions have weight that can tip the meter one way or the other, is only really valid in a game setting. In reality, there's no universal balance, and while you can't really make up for your mistakes, you can atone for them by striving to make better decisions in the future. In Arthur's case, this means forgiving the debts and breaking the cycle that Strauss has been perpetrating to try and do right by at least some of the families. Especially in the case of the last family, he might not be able to bring back the husband and father who died trying to pay back the loan, but he can hopefully have a positive impact on them so they don't wind up in the same place Mrs. Downs and her son wound up. Giving them money to help them out is a start, but like the woman says before disappearing, Arthur, and by extension Strauss, could try doing things differently in the future, like not threatening people. Taking that lesson to heart, Arthur does something that he should have done before the opening credits rolled and throws Strauss out of the camp. The old man tries to draw pity, but his way of doing things isn't anything to be proud of, and with how many lives he's likely ruined, he probably deserves much worse than he gets. The game itself gives Arthur a chance to do good through a couple of stranger missions in this chapter, but those missions deserve their own videos. The point of them is to offer the player a way to make up for low-honor decisions from earlier in the game, but as we've discussed, there really is no making up for those things, at least not in real life. And that can be one of the hardest pills to swallow for a lot of people. We all make mistakes as we go through life, with some causing more harm than others. And often, we find ourselves reminiscing later in life and regretting the pain that we've caused. We want to make up for it, to feel better about ourselves, but actions cannot be undone. You can treat people better in the future, try to do good things and leave a positive impact, but there is no turning back the clock and no honor meter to swing to the other end. Accepting that and understanding that everything we do has consequences is an important step in making the world better overall. Mean words, the decision to get behind the wheel after a couple of drinks, choosing to work late instead of going to your kid's game, you can't take back or make up for those things. But thinking about them ahead of time, taking the time to really contemplate a situation, can really make all of the difference. In Arthur's case, his time in the world is limited. He can't go back and build a life with Mary, or save the son that he lost. He can't fix things that he's broken like the Downs family, or those he's beaten, robbed, and killed. But he can do his best with the time that he has left to make better choices. And the biggest one that he makes is to push for John's safety. Arthur may not be able to escape or make up for anything, but he can pass along what he's learned and give John a chance to live on and actually save his wife and son from the life of an outlaw. And that starts with a trip to help John blow up a bridge as part of Micah's latest scheme. The idea is that blowing up the bridge will force the army to send a train with weapons and payroll, giving the gang a chance for that final big score that Dutch keeps talking about. The plan kind of works, but John is lost in the train heist, with his fate being temporarily up in the air, and Abigail is kidnapped while the gang is on that job. Arthur and Sadie manage to save her, ensuring Jack won't lose both parents in one day, and we get the most emotional few moments of the game as Arthur rides back to confront Dutch. Donning his trademark hat, Daniel Lanois' That's the Way It Is plays as we relive some of the most pivotal moments of the game in the background. This is our final chance to reflect on Arthur and the impact that he's had on the world around him. We might not have had the chance to make all of the choices, and we might not have agreed with the choices that he made all of the time, but we did have more of an impact than you might realize. There's the obvious things, like choosing to pull Jimmy Brooks up or let him fall, but there's also a lot of lives that you can touch as Arthur throughout the game. There's people like Albert Mason, who you can assist through several encounters. Penelope Braithwaite and Beau Gray, who you can help escape their families and find a happily ever after. A man in Valentine who just needs someone to talk to. A traveling circus with some odd animals and the world's bravest woman. A doctor in Rhodes who had his wagon stolen, and the list goes on and on. At the heart of the game, we find that Arthur isn't some evil person who robs and kills because he likes it. He's actually full of more good than he realizes. He has one final stand to make, and he's joined by his surrogate brother as John comes in at the last minute to help take down Dutch and Micah. I won't go into detail here, as the escape is full of the gunfire and excitement that you would expect. But Arthur has one final choice to make before the end. He can go with John, help him escape up the mountain, or he can go back for the money that Dutch has hidden in the cave. If he's learned from his mistakes, as he should have by now, the only choice here is to help John. Going back for the money, especially as he knows that he's short on time in this world, would be incredibly stupid. Not only is he likely to be killed in the attempt, but it would show that he was still more worried about something that can be easily replaced, while the man he grew up with and fought alongside is left on his own. Helping John escape, Arthur is faced with the final challenge as Micah corners him on the top of the mountain. There's an epic fight that culminates with an intervention by Dutch, and Arthur is left to take his final breath alone as the sun rises on the world that he leaves behind. And that's where we'll end things as well. There's an epilogue, which we'll likely cover at some point, but as far as Red Dead Redemption 2 in the Philosophy and Ethics in Game series goes, that's the story of the fall of the Vanderlyn gang and Arthur Morgan's demise. This game is one of the most nuanced and deep games that we've covered in the series to this point. And just like when the story comes to an end in a playthrough, a part of me is sad to see it finish. There's a lot of little details and philosophical topics the game presents, and many of them are often overlooked because the beauty of the world, the gameplay, and the story take center stage. But I'm happy to have had the chance to cover the game in this series. Moving on, we'll be diving into another game that I'm excited to cover though, Detroit Become Human. That game has been talked about for its choices and replayability, but there's still a lot to unpack from a philosophy and ethics standpoint. So I hope you'll join me next week as we start diving into that game. The best way to make sure you don't miss that and other games that I cover is to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I put out new Philosophy and Ethics in Games videos every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern, with patrons and channel members getting the chance to see them before everyone else. If you enjoyed the video and got something out of it, hit the like button and share it with others that you think might enjoy it. I want to thank you all for watching. We'll close out with the words of Sister Calderon, and I'll see you in the next one.
Mr. Morgan! Are you okay?
Well, never better. What are you doing here?
Well, I'm on my way down to Mexico. They're finally sending me on a mission. Brother Dorkins is very jealous. What's wrong?
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks. I've lived a bad life, sister.
We've all lived bad lives, Mr. Morgan. We all sin. But I know you.
You don't know me.
Forgive me, but that's the problem. You don't know you.
What do you mean?
I don't know, but whenever we happen to meet, you're always helping people and smiling.
I had a son. He passed away. I had a girl who loved me. I threw that away. My mama died when I was a kid. And my daddy, well, I watched him die. And it weren't soon enough.
My husband died a long time ago. Life is full of pain. But there is also love and beauty.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I.
Huh?
But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard! I shall try.
I know you will.